Imagine for a second that you are backed into a corner.
Okay.
And you really only have two options. Option A is absolute chaos.
Right.
Total unpredictability. Your city might be raided tomorrow, there's no safety net, and just no underlying structure to your life whatsoever.
Sounds terrifying.
It is. But option B is absolute tyranny. You give up your freedom, you surrender your voice, and you lose all personal agency. But in return, you get order.
You get security.
Exactly. You get to wake up knowing the walls of your house will still be standing. So which one do you choose?
Wow. I mean, that is an incredibly heavy dilemma.
It really is. And as we're going to explore in today's deep dive, it's the exact agonizing choice that has defined the history of an entire nation. So welcome to the show.
Glad to be here.
Today, we are immersing ourselves in the incredibly complex, often heartbreaking, but ultimately resilient Iranian struggle for freedom. We've got a really sweeping historical text today that traces this entire journey.
Yeah, and it's a journey that really requires us to zoom out. I mean, to truly understand the headlines you see today, the protests in the streets, the massive social upheaval, those relentless demands for change, we have to look way back.
Way back, like ancient history back.
Exactly. We have to examine the deep, ancient roots of authority and law in the region. Because you simply cannot understand the sheer bravery of the current pushback without understanding the massive historical weight of what these people are pushing against.
That makes total sense. So our mission today is to map out this history with you. We're going to trace a path from ancient legal codes all the way to modern street protests to understand the forces driving today's reality in Iran.
It's a lot of ground to cover.
It is. But we have to start at the beginning, right, with the evolution of Iranian law. Because this isn't a story that just started a few decades ago with a modern revolution.
Not at all.
It goes all the way back to antiquity. We're talking about things like the Cyrus Cylinder.
Right, which is often considered one of the earliest declarations of human rights.
Exactly. But from there, according to the source material, the legal frameworks become increasingly rigid.
Very rigid.
We see the codification of behavior in ancient Zoroastrian texts like the Vandidad.
Yes.
And then the development of highly sophisticated, incredibly strict administrative systems during the Sassanid Empire.
And that Sassanid era is crucial. We are talking about massive, sprawling bureaucracies that were designed to control and categorize everyday life.
It was managing everything.
Everything. And from there, as history progresses and empires shift, that rigid legalistic tradition flows right into Islamic Shariat and Fiqh.
Which is Islamic jurisprudence.
Right. It is essentially a long, continuous, unbroken chain of authorities codifying exactly how human beings are supposed to behave, think, and exist.
And running entirely parallel to this evolution of strict law is the evolution of a very specific culture of authority.
Yes, the culture is key here.
The text shows the early roots of tyranny becoming deeply embedded in a heavily religious, deeply conservative, and undeniably male-dominated culture.
It was a society built from the ground up on strict, unquestionable hierarchies.
Right, and the historical terminology the source provides really brings this to life.
It does. On the political side, you had figures of absolute unchecked power. Titles like the Sultan.
Or the Khan, or the Valley.
Exactly. These were not elected officials you could debate at a town hall. These were rulers whose authority was final and absolute.
Unquestionable.
Completely unquestionable. But what makes this history so deeply ingrained in the psyche of the region is that this top-down structure wasn't just a political reality. It was completely mirrored in spiritual and religious life as well.
Okay, let's unpack this, because this is where the cultural conditioning really takes hold.
Yeah.
How did this hierarchy actually play out in someone's day-to-day spiritual life?
It played out through relationships defined entirely by submission. You had the dynamic between a morshed, meaning a spiritual guide, and a morid, the seeker.
The master and the student, basically.
Right, or the relationship between the morid, the master, and the follower. In every aspect of life, there was a clearly defined master and a clearly defined subject.
So it's this fundamental idea that there is always someone above you who holds the answers.
Yes.
And your only role is to follow their lead.
Precisely. And in the realm of religious authority, this gets formalized through the concepts of ijtihad and taqlid.
Ijtihad and taqlid. Let's break those down.
So ijtihad is the process of independent reasoning or interpretation of the law. But that right is reserved strictly for a tiny, elite few at the very top.
So regular people can't do it.
Not at all. The vast majority of the population was expected to practice taqlid.
Which basically translates to imitation, right?
It does.
So to put it in modern terms for you listening, Practicing Taglit is almost like clicking agree on a massive software terms and conditions document.
That is a perfect analogy.
You don't read it, you don't question it, you certainly don't debate the legal nuances with the company. You just click agree and follow the rules set by the experts.
You don't question. You imitate the rulings of the authorities. And when your entire political, spiritual, and religious reality is built on this premise, tyranny doesn't just feel like an imposition from the outside.
It's just normal.
It becomes the water you swim in. It is the accepted default state of the universe.
Which brings us back to that massive aha moment and the question we posed at the very beginning of the deep dive. Why on earth would generation after generation accept this?
It's the survival instinct.
Right. History shows us that for the most part, the Iranian people have been repeatedly forced to choose between chaos and tyranny. And time again, historical circumstances force them to choose tyranny. But why was the chaos so terrifying?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, you have to look at the geography. Iran sits at the crossroads of empires.
It's right in the middle of everything.
Throughout history, it has been a superhighway for invading armies. The Greeks, the Mongols, the Arabs, the Ottomans.
Just constant waves of invasion.
Yes. So if the alternative to submitting to a heavy-handed, oppressive sultan is having your city sacked, your trade routes burned to ash, and your family placed in constant physical danger from absolute anarchy.
You accept the heavy hand.
You accept it. You trade your liberty for a predictable reality. Over centuries, that agonizing trade-off becomes woven into the very social fabric of the nation. Survival meant submission.
But, and this is a huge but, it wasn't all just top-down oppression.
No, absolutely not.
If you are listening to this and thinking it sounds like an incredibly dark, suffocating history, it is vital to know that there were profound counter voices.
Very important ones.
There were these brilliant glimmers of tolerance and rationalism in Iranian history and literature that actively pushed back against that dominant culture of submission.
The search for freedom, tolerance, and justice is heavily present in Iranian literature, poetry, and philosophy. The desire for liberty never disappeared.
It just had to find creative ways to express itself under immense pressure. There is this incredible example from the text of a figure named Karagani, who stands out as a massive beacon of tolerance. He was an 11th century mystic, and he had a famous decree hung above the door to his sanctuary.
It's a beautiful quote.
It really is. It translates to, "Whoever enters this house, give them bread and do not ask of their faith. For whoever is worth a soul to the Creator is certainly worth bread at the table of Abul Hassan."
It's incredibly powerful.
Think about how radical that level of humanistic acceptance is. In a deeply conservative, fiercely hierarchical society that obsessively categorized people, he is basically saying, I don't care what you believe, you are human, sit down and eat.
It is a stunning statement of humanism. And alongside that kind of radical tolerance, history points to signs of deep rationalism.
Like Omar Khayyam.
A perfect example.
Yeah.
In the West, he's mostly known as a poet, but he was a brilliant mathematician and astronomer.
A real polymath.
Yes. He represents a current of intellectual thought in Iran that valued science, reason, and questioning the mechanics of the universe, rather than just blindly accepting religious dogma.
Khayyam is such a fascinating symbol for rationalism. He's looking at the stars and doing complex algebra while the authorities are demanding blind imitation.
Right.
But we do have to mention the tragic caveat here, don't we?
We do, and it is a sobering reality to acknowledge. These voices, the Karaganis, the Khayyams, the champions of rationalism and justice, they were never the dominant voices.
They were the exception.
They existed, they were profoundly important to the culture, and they are beloved today. But historically, they were the exception, not the rule. The overarching rule remained that strict structure of absolute authority.
Which transitions us beautifully into the modern awakening. Because eventually, those exceptions started demanding to become the rule.
Things started to shift.
As we move into the late 19th and early 20th centuries, two massive catalysts for change are introduced: public education and the printing of newspapers.
And this changes everything.
It has to, right?
Completely. Suddenly, you have mechanisms for spreading ideas that completely bypass the traditional hierarchies. Knowledge is no longer locked away in the palace of the Sultan or guarded by the Morshed.
It's out in the open.
It is being printed on cheap paper, circulated in cafes, and taught in public schools.
And once you start educating the public and circulating news, the traditional center of authority gets directly challenged. We see two massive movements shake the foundations of Iranian society during this era. First, the Babi movement in the mid-19th century.
The Babi movement was a critical earthquake. It was a grassroots religious movement that fundamentally challenged the dominant centric religious norms.
It questioned the absolute authority of the clerics.
Yes, and it served as a massive structural shock to the religious hierarchy of the time.
And right on the heels of that, challenging the political side of the house, was the Constitutional Revolution in the early 1900s. And this wasn't just people asking for a nicer king.
No, not at all.
They were challenging the dominant, centric political norms entirely. For the first time, they demanded a constitution. They wanted a parliament.
They wanted the rule of law to sit above the ruler.
Rather than the ruler being the law.
Exactly. And that demand for modernization eventually leads us to the era of Reza Shah in the 1920s and 30s.
Now, the text notes Reza Shah was still an authoritarian ruler.
He was,
Mm-hmm.
but his reforms played a pivotal role in building the infrastructure that a modern democracy requires. He looked at Western democracies. He looked at the aggressive modernization happening next door in Turkey.
Under Ataturk.
Right. And he pushed for rapid change. He built the basis for a modern economy, expanded secular public education, and created modern state institutions.
It was a whiplash period of shifting norms. And then during World War II, Reza Shah is forced out of power, which creates this fascinating, incredibly rare window in Iranian history, a period of genuine, albeit short-lived, political freedom.
That brief window allowed for a massive surge in political expression. You suddenly had a society flexing democratic muscles it hadn't been allowed to use for centuries.
And this era culminates in the rise of Mossadegh, right?
Yes, Mohammad Mossadegh and his nationalist movement. Mossadegh was the democratically elected prime minister, and his primary goal was to nationalize Iran's oil industry.
To take the wealth of the nation back from foreign control.
Exactly, and use it to build a modern, independent state.
And a huge engine for this intellectual and political explosion was the youth. The historical record highlights the massive role of Iranian college students during this era.
They were crucial.
We are talking about students both inside the country at newly established universities and a huge wave of students studying abroad in the U.S. and Europe.
This is a critical juncture. These students were instrumental in acting as a bridge. They were studying abroad, absorbing the dominant global philosophies of the 20th century, and transferring a massive spectrum of political ideas back inside Iran.
And just to be perfectly impartial here, as we report what's in the text, they were bringing back absolutely everything.
Everything.
Yeah.
You had students importing hard left-wing Marxist ideologies.
Yeah.
You had students advocating for Western-style liberalism. And you had fierce nationalists.
So you have Marxists, liberals, secular nationalists, and traditionalists all sitting in the same university cafes in Tehran trying to agree on the future of the country.
Yes.
That sounds like a total intellectual melting pot, but also a recipe for a massive clash.
It was a vibrant, chaotic exchange of ideas. But as we know from history, melting pots under immense pressure, especially with foreign powers interfering, as we saw with the eventual coup against Mossadegh, they tend to boil over.
Here's where it gets really interesting and truly devastating. We arrive at the 1979 Islamic Revolution.
Great derailment.
Exactly. And it is crucial to understand how this started. It began as a massive, broad coalition revolution for freedom.
It was Marxists, liberals, students, and clerics all marching together to overthrow a king.
But it derailed incredibly quickly.
It derailed into a much worse dictatorship. The attempt to overthrow one form of monarchical tyranny resulted in the installation of another, even more absolute form of tyranny.
A theocratic dictatorship.
Yes. The clerics consolidated power and ruthlessly purged everyone else who had marched alongside them.
And the human cost of that purge, detailed in the sources, is just staggering. It didn't just slowly shift into a theocracy. The new regime enforced its rule with unimaginable brutality.
The mass executions that took place are a dark stain on history. The source specifically cites the mass executions in the Iranian calendar years 1357, 1360, and 1367.
Just wave after wave of violence.
Yes. During these periods, vans would pull up, people would vanish, and thousands were executed in secret. The Islamic regime systematically vanished all opposition voices.
If you were a Marxist, a liberal, a nationalist, or just a student who disagreed with the new system, you were eliminated.
You were gone.
It is that ancient dilemma returning with a vengeance. The society tried to reject tyranny, plunged into the terrifying chaos of a revolution, and a new, vastly more brutal tyranny capitalized on the population's fear of chaos to establish absolute order.
But the desire for liberty didn't completely die.
No, it didn't. There was a brief moment in the late 90s where it seemed like reform might be possible with the election of Mohammad Khatami.
Yes, Khatami brought a massive wave of hope. He ran on a platform of reform, civil society, and the rule of law.
People genuinely thought the system could be fixed from within.
They thought that theocracy could slowly be moderated, but those hopes faded rapidly under the oppression of the supreme leader.
Because the supreme leader holds veto power over everything.
Exactly. The absolute authority simply choked out any meaningful democratic change. The reformists hit a brick wall.
Which brings us into the modern era. Once the people realized the system could absolutely not be reformed from within the ballot box, they took to the street.
And they haven't stopped.
The modern history of Iran is defined by a continuous, relentless pushback. It's an incredible, cascading list of modern movements from the source that proves it's not just one fringe group complaining, it's the entire society resisting.
The diversity of these movements is what makes the current era so striking.
Let's look at a few of them. You had the Green Movement, where millions of people flooded the streets. You had the Inglab Street Girls.
Taking off their mandatory hijabs in plain sight.
Right. Then you have Bloody Avon, the Teachers Movement, the Bus Drivers Movement, and critically, the Bazaar Movement.
The Bazaar movement is huge.
For anyone who might not know, why is a strike at the Bazaar such a massive deal?
Because the bazaars are the economic beating heart of the country. Historically, the merchant class in the bazaars has always been a pillar of the establishment. When they shut down and go on strike, they are essentially cutting off the regime's economic lifeblood.
Wow. And of course, all of this culminated in the Zendegi Azadi movement.
The woman, life, freedom movement.
Right. What this incredible list demonstrates is that the resistance has crossed all socioeconomic boundaries. It's teachers, factory workers, wealthy merchants, young women, university students.
Everyone.
But the regime's response has remained grimly rooted in that ancient reliance on brutal authority. A tragic example of this from the text is the massacre known as Dark Friday.
Yes, where the supreme leader ordered forces to open fire on protesters.
Resulting in a horrific loss of life. But here's where the dynamic has fundamentally shifted, hasn't it?
It has. Unlike those mass executions in the Iranian calendar years at 1357, 1360, and 1367, which terrified the public into silence, that old tactic isn't working anymore.
People aren't retreating in terror.
No. Instead of retreating after Dark Friday, the students and citizens are braver than ever. They were back out on the streets, protesting in remembrance exactly 40 days after the massacre.
The fear barrier is breaking.
Exactly. The regime is now brutally turning against itself, against its own people, but the traditional mechanism of using ultimate violence to force submission is failing.
Adding to this incredible internal pressure, the text notes a massive geopolitical shockwave.
A power vacuum.
Right. The USA killing the Ayatollah, leaving the country with a huge power vacuum. It totally destabilized the regime's aura of invincibility.
What's fascinating here is the paradox that this power vacuum, combined with the newfound bravery on the streets, has created.
Paradox how?
Well, the Iranian people are undeniably uniting against this Islamic regime. From the teachers to the bazaar merchants, there is a fierce consensus that the current absolute tyranny is completely unacceptable and must end.
They are completely united against the regime, but they remain deeply divided over hundreds of different political and societal arguments.
Exactly. When you have a society that spent the last century importing everything from Marxism to Western liberalism, and you have diverse movements with different priorities, their vision for what a free Iran looks like is wildly different.
They agree 100% on the problem, but they are divided on the blueprint for the solution.
Precisely.
So what does this all mean for you listening right now? If we synthesize this incredible journey, we've zoomed way out from the ancient Zoroastrian legal codes and the rigid hierarchies of the Sultan and the Morshed,
We've tracked the beautiful glimmers of tolerance from Karagani.
and the rationalism of Khayyam. We've seen how public schools, newspapers, and brave students studying abroad tried to break the mold, only to see a revolution for freedom get hijacked into a brutal theocracy.
It is a continuous, agonizing struggle.
It really is. A struggle between a deeply ingrained societal habit of accepting tyranny just to buy a little security from the chaos, and the unbreakable, persistent human desire for liberty that we are seeing on the streets today.
And it leaves us with a final thought to really mull over. If the historical norm for this society has always been to accept tyranny just to avoid chaos, What happens when the tyrannical regime itself becomes the primary source of the chaos?
That's a great question.
As the nation faces a power vacuum and a population divided by hundreds of arguments, is the current unity against the regime enough to finally break the centuries-old cycle? Or will the fear of chaos invite a new form of tyranny?
It is a breathtaking question, and it's the reality playing out in the headlines every single day. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the historical roots of the Iranian struggle for freedom. Keep seeking out the history behind the headlines, and always keep questioning the world around you. We'll catch you on the next deep dive.